A lot of gardeners, especially beginners, find the process of indoor seed starting to be intimidating. It seems like a lot of work, a lot of equipment, and just maybe too much fuss. But starting your own seeds is a really economical way to get boatloads of variety in your garden without breaking the bank, and a great way to grow varieties that you would never find in the garden center or your local nursery. Some seed packets will tell you approximately when to start seeds indoors based on your last frost date. Others give you only when to plant the seeds outdoors or transplant, and others give you exactly zero information. And even if the packet says when to start them, that may not be accurate for every area. And we all know your garden conditions are completely different from mine, even if we live in the same county. Plus, once those seed orders are rolling in, your garden plan is shaping up, the days are slowly starting to get a little bit longer, we start to get restless. We want to get our hands in the dirt. This leads to the temptation to get started on our indoor seed starting, but for most of us, it really isn't time to start very many of those seeds just yet. This will depend on your growing zone, of course, and when your last spring frost date is, if you have one, but it will also depend on what you're planning to grow. Today on Just Grow Something, we're going to narrow down step by step how to time your seed starting, whether you're just dipping your toe in or you've been doing it for a while. It does take practice to get the timing right, and there is no foolproof plan because conditions change from year to year. But by the end, you will know exactly what steps to take to get yourself as close to target as possible, so you don't have 18-inch tomato plants begging to be planted a full 3 weeks before it's warm enough for them to go outside. Speaking from experience. Let's dig in.
Hey, I'm Karen, and what started as a small backyard garden 20 years ago turned into a lifelong passion for growing food. Now, as a market farmer and horticulturist, I want to help you do the same. On this podcast, I am your friend in the garden, teaching evidence-based techniques to help you grow your favorites and build confidence in your own garden space. So grab your garden journal and a cup of coffee and get ready to just grow something.
If you still have not finalized your garden plan and you need a little bit of help getting there, my garden planning workbook is available right now in the shop at justgrowsomething.com/shop. I will leave a link straight to it in the show notes. It's $10 and it takes you through all the steps that we talked about throughout January for your planning process in a lot more detail. So check that out. It is officially February, y'all, and we are moving at breakneck speed toward the beginning of the gardening season here. We've already got our spring mix started in the greenhouse. Seed starting is underway in the seedling room with the onions and some of the really slow-growing herbs, but those are the only seeds that I've gotten started. It really is easy to get overexcited about the gardening season and want to jump in on growing by starting things way too early and then finding yourself with a boatload of seedlings that have nowhere to go because the conditions are not right outside. Trust me, been there, done that a lot. And we're going to talk a lot about seed starting this month. So I thought that the question of the month for February should be, what do you struggle with most in starting seeds indoors? Let me know in the comments if you're on Spotify or on YouTube. Send me a DM on social, put your comment in the Facebook group, or send me an email. What do you struggle with when it comes to starting seeds for transplant? You will have until February 21st to get these answers to me. I'm cutting it off early so that I have time to compile everything for you for the first episode in March, because I'm trying to be more organized and ahead of the game on these episodes in 2025. So far, so good, but we'll see how long that lasts as we move further into the growing season. So answer the question by February 21st, please, and thank you. So the process that we're going to go through is one that I used years ago to determine my seed starting dates, and then I put my dates on a sheet that stays in my garden planning binder. I updated those dates as I went through each season. I got more successful at the timing, and now I generally can just glance at the list and put my dates on the calendar so that I have an easy to follow schedule for when things need to be started. This is especially helpful if you have limited space to start seeds and you want to start both cool season and warm season plants. Some plants need longer indoors than others. Some need heat to get started. Some need light right away. And so knowing when each one should be started based on when it goes out in the garden is very, very handy. Now, I do adjust these dates a little bit sometimes based on new data coming from my garden journal, for example. So, like, I'm starting my tomatoes about a week later this season than last because I found they were a little bit more overgrown than I like them to be last year by the time the soil was warm enough to plant them. Like everything else in the garden, we need to be flexible and be willing to continue learning every year to become better gardeners and have a more successful season. So, as you sort of take these steps to figure out what your seed starting dates are, keep track of them and then keep track of what actually happens in your garden this year. And then you can look back next year on that list and decide whether or not you need to tweak some things. And if you keep that record, it's going to make it easier for you, almost a no brainer from season to season of when you're supposed to start those seeds. Now, in most cases, whenever you buy seeds online or from a catalog or in the little packets at the garden center, they're going to have some basic information. Usually, this information includes a description of the plant, its plant family, whatever variety it is, and then hopefully a picture. And then there's usually a bunch of other required information like the number of seeds or the weight and the year it was packed, etc. It will sometimes also have directions that explain how best to plant that seed, like whether it should be started indoors or if it prefers to be directly sown outdoors. This information is good to have because it guides you in whether the seed will do well indoors or if it really should be started in place out in the garden. Most root crops, for example, should not be started indoors and then transplanted because disturbing those roots can cause them to grow improperly and be sort of wonky. And that's going to affect your yield. But there are plenty of packets that will tell you to sow directly in the ground that may not take into consideration where you live. So if you generally have very short lived spring weather and the temperatures begin to soar pretty early in the season, but the packet tells you to sow your spinach seeds directly in the garden, those plants may bolt by the time that you're ready to harvest because it's just too darn warm in your area. So you may want to start your spinach indoors and then transplant them out at the time that the packet tells you to direct sow them in order to get a few harvests before it gets too hot. The same thing goes if you're in an area that has a very short window to grow warm season crops. It may be common for okra to be directly sown in place. I would never consider transplanting my okra. I don't start it indoors and then transplant it outside. But if you need those plants to get to maturity and start producing very quickly because you have a very short window of opportunity, then you might need to start them indoors and transplant them out when the temperatures are appropriate in order to get a harvest. Now, as a side note, you've likely read the phrase on some seed packets or in starting instructions that say, as soon as the soil can be worked, right? When you're reading about planting instructions for your spring crops. As soon as the soil can be worked is just the state that your soil is in where it's not too wet to plant into. And it's, like, not still frozen, obviously, if you're in a colder climate. So you just kinda wanna test your soil's workability by squeezing a handful of soil in the palm of your hand. When you open your hand, if the soil stays in, like, a wet, solid clump, that is not workable. That is too wet. If it crumbles a little bit when you touch it in your palm, then it's workable. This means it's ready to take on some direct sown seeds or some early transplants if the soil and the air temperatures are conducive to what you're planting. If you don't wait until the soil is workable and it's in this sort of crumbly condition and you try to dig into it or till it, you are not only destroying the soil texture, but you are also compacting that soil around the plants and the seeds that you're trying to grow, which is reducing the air and the soil water space for those plants and their roots. This is no bueno, okay? So be patient when trying to plan when to direct sow or transplant your plants. The steps to figuring out when to start seeds indoors are the same, regardless of where you garden. The dates are just going to be different once you're finished. And again, this is going to be an estimate. So keep track of the actual dates that you plant, transplant, and harvest so you know whether or not you need to change things the next season. Make notes of the condition of the plants when you transplanted. Were the tomatoes so tall that you had to dig them in sideways to keep them from flopping over? If so, they were either started too early or they were planted too late. Make a note. Were the peppers already flowering when you transplanted, and did those blooms drop, or were they okay and they produced fruit? Make a note. Journal, journal, journal. I know I harp on that a lot, but if you really want a better garden, a better yield, and less frustration from year to year, then keeping notes about what happened during the season so you can make corrections for the next year is really important. If you're not worried about it and you enjoy completely winging it, well, no harm, no foul. Do what you want. I know plenty of you are really successful this way. My garden homie, Cody, she took my Plan Like a Pro course and she decided she's just not a planner and she prefers to be really spontaneous in the garden. And she had a great gardening year last year. But she does still keep a record of what's happening from year to year in order to improve the garden the next year. I don't care if it's sticky notes, scribbles on a seed packet, photos in your phone, whatever it is, something you can look back on. Keeping a record makes you a better gardener, period. Okay? All right, I'm off my soapbox. The seed starting guidance that we're going to talk about, keep in mind the typical weather patterns in your area when listening to recommendations. You may need to make some adjustments, okay? Frost dates are the most common guide for figuring out when to start seeds, whether it's spring or fall. But if you live at a high elevation, understand that frost dates might not always be your best guide for this, and that you will likely need to stick to growing mostly cool weather veggies outdoors and growing any heat-loving plants in like a heated greenhouse or even an indoor sunroom. You might live in a particular hardiness zone, but mountain regions often have drastically different microclimates over the span of just a few miles. So you need to be realistic and a little bit flexible with what you grow and when you grow it. You may also live somewhere that doesn't usually see a frost, and we'll get to you here in a minute. For the rest of us, the first thing to do for spring seed starting is determine when your last spring frost date is on average. I will link to a page in the show notes that's going to help you determine that average date for your area. Just remember that this date is an average, and it actually only has a probability of about 30%. So even though our last frost date in my area is around April 20th, we've had frost pretty routinely as late as April 25th or later. And we've had our last frost as early as April 5th. But it's a good guideline for planting cool weather crops and for when to start our seeds. A frost, as we call it, is actually a light freeze. So the classification of freeze temperatures is based on their effect on plants. So temperatures between 29 Fahrenheit and 32 Fahrenheit, or negative 1.7 Celsius to 0 Celsius, is when tender plants are killed. So this is what we're considering a frost. The biggest mistake that I made in my early years of gardening was waiting too long to transplant my spring plants outside because I was worried that it was going to be too cold and a frost like that might damage those plants. And it's a mistake that I see repeated by a lot of gardeners over and over again. I did this for years and couldn't figure out why it wasn't working out. Cool weather plants are much more hardy than we give them credit for. So harden them off properly and get them in the ground earlier rather than later. This also means starting them indoors earlier than you might think. Warm weather crops have the opposite problem, and I've seen that too. You very well may be starting some of your warm weather plants at the same time you're starting some of the cool weather ones, but we need to be patient about getting them in the ground. They are much more concerned with proper soil temperatures at transplant time, and they can be stunted if we get them in the ground too early, regardless of whether the air temperatures are appropriate or not. So start early on the cool weather plants and then have patience with the warm weather ones. Now, if you don't get a frost in your area, then you obviously can't rely on the last frost date as your guide. But you can find a date that is suitable for planting and work back from there the same way as the rest of us use the frost date. This date is going to be based on your average temperatures. And so you're going to want to find the date when your average daytime air temperatures begin to climb above 50 degrees Fahrenheit for figuring out when to transplant your cool weather plants. For your warm weather ones, again, we're more concerned about soil temperatures, and those usually need to be above 60 Fahrenheit at a minimum for warm weather plants, but most of them actually prefer closer to 70 Fahrenheit. So either your transplant date is based on your frost date or your air and soil dates. Either way, I'm going to give you some guidelines on when to start the seeds of some of the most popular cool weather plants and then to plan to move them to your outside garden beds or your containers. And then we'll talk about the warm weather crops too. Some of these dates might surprise you. So let's start with the cool weather crops and when to start them and when to transplant them. I will refer to frost date here, but you warmer climate folks can substitute your chosen date for transplanting based on your air temperatures in your soil, or mostly your air temperatures. So in general, if you're going by frost date, a lot of our cool weather plants are planted out prior to the last frost. So cabbage and cauliflower, for example, they generally go out as early as 4 weeks prior to our last frost. Broccoli is around 2 weeks because it tends to be a little bit more sensitive. These crops can handle the cold. And so putting them out early enough means that they're not going to bolt before they get to maturity because the weather got too hot too fast. This is a really typical problem in my area, especially with broccoli. If I were to wait until after our last frost date to transplant broccoli, it would be way too warm by the time it was ready to form its head, and it would either try to go to flower or it would get very, very bitter. What this means is if I'm transplanting cabbage and cauliflower 3 to 4 weeks before my last frost date, I need to have those plants ready to go on or around March 20th, right? And then my broccoli like 2 weeks later. So I need to count back to see when I need to start those plants indoors. So generally speaking, those plants need about 5 to 6 weeks to grow indoors to be at the right size for transplant. That means my cabbage and my cauliflower seeds need to be started around February 6th and my broccoli around February 20th. So if you're timing this by transplant date, then find your transplant date based on when the average air temperature gets above 50 Fahrenheit in the spring, and then count backwards from there about 4 to 6 weeks. That's going to give you enough time to start the seeds, wait for them to germinate, grow them on, and then harden them off before putting them in the garden. I tend to err on the side of earlier rather than later for my cool weather plants. So I start mine 6 weeks out from my expected transplant date. Now for lettuces, these dates are a little bit different. So I'm planting them out around 3 weeks before our last frost, and I'm starting them indoors about 4 weeks prior to that. Collards, I'm planting out about a month before last frost, and I'm starting those about a month before transplant. Again, this is just what I'm putting on my calendar. I will start them on time, but I am flexible about when they actually go out into the garden. If I've hardened them off for about a week and then I check the soil temperature and it's still only at like 35, 40 Fahrenheit, I'm waiting about another week or so to transplant my collards, even if the air temperature is conducive for growth. Some gardeners say, nope, it's 4 weeks before last frost, those puppies are going in. That isn't usually too much of a problem for the cool weather plants if the air temperatures are okay. Where we run into a problem is with the warm weather crops. Plants like tomatoes and peppers and other summer crops that like those really warm temperatures during the growing season can often be stunted if they are planted outside too early, specifically if the soil temperatures are too cool. Most written planting guides are going to tell you to put your warm weather plants out into the garden 1 to 2 weeks after your last frost date in the spring. This is where experience is better than relying blindly on a chart. My area has a last frost date of around April 20th, which, by this 2-week wisdom, would tell me to put my tomatoes and peppers and melons in the ground around May 4th. Not only have we had frosts after that April 20th date, but our soil temperatures are not nearly warmed up enough by May 4th to be putting warm weather plants in the ground and expecting them to thrive. These written guidelines are only concerned with average air temperatures. They don't take into consideration the soil temperatures in your area. But soil temperatures are just as important for plant growth as the air temperatures, perhaps even more so at the transplant stage. Soil temperatures should be at a minimum of 60 degrees Fahrenheit for warm weather plants. But in order for the plant to truly do well, the soil should ideally be closer to 70 Fahrenheit or 21 Celsius. The colder the soil is when you transplant those heat-loving plants, the less able those plants are to take up nutrients, get established in the new soil, and put their energy into new growth. So if you put these plants in too early, they will sit there and wait until the temperatures are right before continuing their growth. And a lot can happen in that time to cause damage to those plants and their root systems while they're not fully established. So, where many gardeners wait too long to plant their spring crops, many of us also plant our summer crops too early. I mean, I get it. We're all anxious to get the season going. Our seedlings are overflowing out of our houses and they're begging to go in the ground. This is partly why timing when to start those seedlings can be based on the last average frost date, but transplanting itself should be based on optimum soil temperatures and not just an arbitrary date on the calendar. So plan your seed starting of your warm season crops by last average frost date or on transplant date based on historical soil temperatures for your area, but be ready to be flexible. This is why my dates for seed starting have changed just a touch this year. They were too tall, the tomatoes were too tall for my liking last year when it came to transplant. And I'm seeing the temperatures this winter well below where they were last year, and I'm anticipating it'll take a little bit longer in the spring for that soil to warm up. Now, the bonus to waiting a little bit longer to transplant is that you can wait a little bit longer to start those seeds. So if you're also starting cool weather crops indoors, this may mean the difference between having enough room for all your plants because the cool season plants are headed out the door before the warm ones sprout, or jamming seedlings into every corner of your house because you have too many going all at once. Some examples for the warm season crops would be planning for tomatoes to go in 2 weeks after last frost, which means starting them about 6 to 8 weeks prior to that date. Peppers need about 8 weeks prior to planting to get going, even longer for hot peppers because they can sometimes take so long to germinate. Eggplant should go in around 3 weeks after last frost, and they can need up to 10 weeks prior to planting to get going. That is your seed starting date. And then if you need to start okra early, you don't want to be transplanting until around 4 weeks after last frost and starting them about 4 to 6 weeks before that transplant date. So essentially, to figure out when to start your seeds, you need to know a couple of things. Number one, when is your last anticipated frost date, or what is your average soil temperature by date? Number two, when should your chosen crops ideally be transplanted? And number three, how long before transplant should those crops be started in order for those plants to be big enough to go in the ground? Now, you can find some of this information on the seed packet or maybe in your seed catalog, or you can look it up all online, or you can download the handy little chart I made you. I'm not going to leave you hanging. I want this to be easy, right? Go to justgrowsomethingpodcast.com/start, or you can just click on the link in the show notes. I put together a chart of 29 vegetables and a couple of common herbs that can be started from seed indoors, when to start the seeds based on transplant date, when to transplant based on last frost date, and when to transplant based on soil temperature, plus what the lowest germination temperature is for each of those crops if you want to try and start them directly in the garden. So this will give you an idea of whether you can just skip the whole indoor seed starting thing and just pop those babies right in the ground, Or if you're a gardener who needs all kinds of time to start seeds early because your soil stays cool for an extended period of time and you'll know which ones you can start and when. JustGrowSomethingPodcast.com/start to get that guide. That's it for this week. Thank you for being here. Don't forget about the question of the month. What do you struggle with most in starting seeds indoors? I want to get those answers to you in time for you all to start your seeds soon enough. Any questions about timing your seed starting or anything else, reach out to me wherever you can find me. I am happy to answer whatever questions you have. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon. For more information about today's topic and to find all the ways you can get in touch with me or support the show, go to justgrowsomethingpodcast.com. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep learning and keep growing.